Our next checkmate, Lolli's mate, happens pretty frequently, but a lot of players don't know the name. So pretty much what happens here is that when this square is open, so the G7 or G2 square, or maybe even the B2 and B7 square, this thing usually happens on the king side though. So when the G7 or G2 square is open and the G pawn has advanced, we get a pawn here, or a bishop, and a queen, and we use the queen to go on G7 to give checkmate. So for example, this pawn here could have been a bishop as well, and as long as we get our queen on G7 with a checkmate in front of the king, this is considered Lolli's mate. So this can also happen when when black tries to fianchetto a piece. For example, previously there might have been a bishop here, and this bishop traded off, and after white moves his pawn to f6, then he can give checkmate with queen to g7 later on. So this is why it's so important to control these dark squares around your king, especially if you're going to fianchetto your bishop. Fianchetting your bishop is not an easy decision to make, and if you do choose to fianchetto your bishop, you need to make sure that you can keep control of those weakened squares in front of your king. So in this position we have a black to move, and here we already see that the setup is complete. White light squares in front of his king are very weak, and black is ready to play the move queen to g2, except for the fact that white has a rook on g1. So since white has a rook on g1, black must find a way to remove that before he gives him checkmate. The easiest way here to do that is to play the move rook to b1. So rook to b1 first pins this rook, so if white simply does nothing, let's say, then he can already come in with queen to g2, checkmate. Notice that the rook cannot take the queen because then black's rook can take white's king. Of course, if white takes black's rook, then queen to g2 is also checkmate. So here pretty much queen to f2 or queen to g2 is inevitable because white doesn't really have any checks and can't really get out of this situation with the queen on g2. Of course, white can also try for Lolli's mate even if black's bishop is not fianchettoed. So here black actually has this pawn structure fully intact, pawns on f7, g7, and h7. However, white can also provoke the weakness by playing the move f6. So after playing the move f6, we have the queen and pawn forcing the g7 pawn to make a move. So once g7 goes to g6, then we see that we already have the weak squares on h6 for us to use. Notice that black didn't have any other alternative. White is threatening to give checkmate on g7, so if he doesn't move his pawn, then, well, that's his problem. So black has to move his pawn to g6, and now white can swoop in with queen to h6, threatening checkmate on g7 after whatever black plays. Notice that here he can't defend the g7 square, and that's the reason that he will lose. So whenever your opponent has weak squares in front of his king, it's always something for you to use. For example, in this position, these two squares are weak, especially since they can use the g7 square. Always be on the lookout for this kind of pattern and get your queen into the opponent's territory by taking advantage of his weak squares.